Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another edition of Faith Matters, where you, our viewers on MTA, set the agenda by the questions you ask. Jazakumullah, and thank you for the questions you've been sending in. And today's Faith Matters is actually going to be focused on a specific issue, which is the existence of God. But before we go into the questions themselves, just as a reminder to all our viewers, if you don't know it yet, the email once again, it's faithmatters@mta.tv. That's Faith Matters, one word, at mta.tv. And the fax number is 44 for the UK, 208 687 8037. I said our topic for discussion today was the existence of God. To answer your questions, I'm absolutely delighted, and it's my great pleasure to welcome a very distinguished panel to Faith Matters. Assalamu alaikum, gentlemen. Welcome to Faith Matters. To my immediate right is Ayaz Mahmood Sahib, who's a well-known face on Faith Matters. He's currently studying at the Ahmadiyya Institute of Languages and Theology. Assalamu alaikum, Ayaz. Welcome. To his right is, again, a growing and familiar face on Faith Matters from the United States, in New York indeed. We're delighted once again to be joined by Hamza Ilyas Saab. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Faith Matters, Hamza Saab. And to his right is a familiar face for people here in the UK, but also it's my pleasure to welcome, I believe for the first time to Faith Matters, Dr. Shakil Ahmed Sahib, who's the Naib Secretary of Tabligh, which is preaching for the UK Jamaat, the UK Ahmadiyya Muslim Association here. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saab, welcome to Faith Matters. Gentlemen, as I said in my introduction, we will be talking about one of the things which is on people's minds no matter what their faith or of no faith, which is the existence of God. And we've got an array of questions, and the first one comes from a gentleman by the name of Tanveer Ahmed Dar Sahib from Birmingham. Assalamu alaikum, Tanveer Saab. Jazakumullah for your questions. He's asked a series of questions, and we'll sort of try and combine a few of them together. But his first question that he asks, and I'm going to sort of take two other elements with it, is if God does not need anything, why did he create anything? So if we sort of park that in our minds for a moment. Linked to that, he also says, if God does not need our service or worship, why would he create the jinn and man to serve him? And the third element is, if all other things worship God by living and following their instincts, why does God require man to do otherwise? So just the first element of that, Dr. Shakil Saab, if I could come to you. If God indeed does not need anything, why did he create?
I think that it reminds me of a Quranic instruction to make an attempt to understand God through his attributes. And being a creator, Khaliq, is one of the important and fundamental attributes of Allah. We see that he's in fact given us clear evidence of the purpose of creation as well in the Quran. And there have been cycles of creation. This cycle that we are going through, as we understand, is not the only cycle that he's ever created. There may have been cycles of creation before. There is definite evidence in the Quran that he's created extraterrestrial life, even though scientists are still wondering whether it is definitely present, and they're looking for signs of it. But we as Muslims believe that extraterrestrial life definitely exists.
Just on that point, so we're absolutely clear, this all kind of thing, normally people talk of it of a sense of fiction, science fiction, or Hollywood indeed, that this ET, as we call it, extraterrestrial life exists. But the Quran is quite specific, and Islam's quite clear on that.
Definitely so. There's clear verse in the Quran that speaks about existence of life outside this planet. And in fact, what the verse also says is that if God wills, at some stage, he will make the human race be put in contact with that life. So in fact, it's food for thought for Muslim scientists.
Yes, very much so.
To be working on this issue. Similarly, there's another verse in the Quran that speaks about the possibility of bringing a more worthy and more able race or life form after the end of the human life. So Allah is inherently a creator, and his attribute is not just about creating something randomly. We know that he is a most kind creator, he's a most beneficent creator, he's a most gracious creator. And then we can also go into more detail about the wisdom of creation, but I suppose that probably come later.
Indeed. No, Jazakumullah, Dr. Saab. Yasab, if I could just come to you with the sort of second element of it, food for thought indeed, as Dr. Saab has said. But Tanveer Saab's also asking about this whole concept of jinn that if God does not need his service or worship, why did he indeed create jinn, and why does God then require man to worship the Creator?
Well, apparently it seems as if he's alluding to a verse in the Holy Quran where Allah the Almighty states, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I have not created the jinn and the men but that they may worship me. Now this whole concept of what is jinn is a long, can run into a long
very
discussion,
briefly,
but
what
very
is jinn?
briefly, the meaning of jinn is anything which is hidden from the common eye of people. So this could refer to such people who don't intermingle with society very often but live in their own separate abodes. But the concept of this verse is that all those people who have been given the mental capacity to recognize and worship their Lord, they have been instructed to do so, and this is the purpose of their life. A lot of people raise this objection that, well, apparently this seems like a very selfish concept then, that Allah expects us to worship Him and this is the purpose of our life. But if we delve deeper into the meaning of ibadat, as mentioned in this verse, you will see that it is quite the opposite. It is not a selfish concept, it is a very sympathetic concept which relates to humankind. Because this word is derived from the Arabic root abada, which means to be a slave, which naturally entails the meaning that in order to fulfill the right of worship, we should follow all of the commands which Allah the Almighty has given us. And we see that there is two aspects of Allah's commands. One are the huququllah, or those rights which are due to God the Almighty, that is worshipping Him, remembering Him, offering our prayers. And
of course.
Then there's another aspect which is called huququl ibad, which are those rights which are due to fellow man, to be sympathetic, to help people, to benefit society in any way, shape or form. And the promised Messiah alayhi salatu wasalam, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, may Allah bless him, he has mentioned something in his books. He says that Allah will forgive those rights which are due to Him if there is a negligence, but He is much more strict as far as the rights are concerned which are owed to man. So if we understand this aspect of worship from this aspect, we will see that Allah is telling us that we should do whatever in our power to help fellow man. And if we do that with the intention of pleasing our Lord, if for example we help a poor man who doesn't have food and we clothe him and we give him food, and we do this with this concept that Allah has told us to do so, and we should be humble and sympathetic, then this is the true essence of worship. So this is not something which should be looked upon from this aspect, that this is a selfishness of God Almighty. It's quite the opposite.
And just picking up, and Jazakumullah, Hamza Sahib, if I could come to you on that concept of worship, because that's the sort of third key element of his, Tanveer Sahib's first questions, which is, he says that all other beings, whatever those beings are in the animal kingdom and all other living things, actually demonstrate their worship by God by the simple act of living. Why is it then incumbent on man to do something different, i.e. worship God? I mean, perhaps he's actually answered his question there as well, that man is different.
He has answered this question as I understood it when I was listening to the question, because man not only lives, right?
But he has certain faculties beyond the animal kingdom, does he?
Sure, and one of them is volition. I think, if, as I understood it, this seems to be the real crux of the question here, that he's pointing out that man is different in that he has volition. And I would venture to say that Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salatu wasalam, the promised Messiah and Imam Mahdi, has pointed out that the existence of man's volition is in fact what entitles man to the beauty of reward for his actions. So this is the most important thing here. For example, as we understand in the Islamic concept of angels, they have no volition. They simply do what they are commanded, and they are, as it were, Allah's computers. When He issues a command, the angels which regulate the universe bring that about. The same goes for the animals and the trees, and Allah says in reference to the trees and the stemless plants, they humbly submit to His will. This is because these things are regulated by the animals, by the angels rather. But man has volition. He has the ability to choose. In other words, He has the ability to put things in their proper place by using his God-given faculties of intelligence and goodness, or I should say his counselor that Allah has placed inside of his heart, or he can put them in his improper place. And this, in fact, is what in religious terms is called a sin. In other words, to put something in its improper place or at the improper time, place, and occasion. This is what would be termed a sin. And then to put it in its proper place is what we would call to do good. So man has that choice, and this is what in fact helps man in his physical, psychological, and spiritual development. The ability to choose and put a thing using his reason, rationality, knowledge in its proper place at its proper time and occasion. And this helps towards man's physical, psychological, and spiritual development.
Jazakallah. There's, as I said, various questions that Tanveer Saab's asking. He then starts with his next sort of series of questions is very much on the attributes of God as well. And we all often, when we talk of God Almighty, we talk that God knows best is a phrase which is often used, and he's all-knowing. God directs the universe, he created the universe, so therefore he's all-powerful as well. And picking up on those aspects, Yasab, the question which Tanveer Saab's also asking, if God is aware of everything that's going to happen or not happen, this means that everything, there's predestination, everything is said, kismat as often is said in Urdu. Given this, how can then God, in quotes from his question, he says, change his mind and do something else? If not, he can't be sort of, all-knowing in that sense.
This is a very interesting question, and it relates to two attributes of Allah the Almighty. We must realize that no attribute contradicts another attribute of God the Almighty. Rather, all of the attributes of God the Almighty run in parallel to one another, just as many streams run in the same direction. So this question directly relates to Allah's attribute of Alim, all-knowing, or omniscience.
Yes.
And then also relates to his attribute of Qadir, or being omnipotent.
Indeed.
How can these two go together? And they present an example. Many atheists, they present an interesting example. They say, for example, Jack went out to commit a crime. Did Allah know out of his perfect knowledge that he was going to commit the crime? If so, did Jack have the ability not to commit the crime? If so, then that means Allah's knowledge would be flawed. And then on the other side, they say that, let's say, if Allah knew that Jack was going to commit the crime, and Jack has to commit the crime, because if he doesn't commit the crime, then Allah's knowledge would be flawed. So you can, and in that case, then everything would be predestined. We don't have the choice to do anything outside the knowledge of God the Almighty. At first thought, it seems like it seems like it takes you back a bit. How can these two things go hand in hand? But they can, because we can understand this from an example, even in our daily lives. It's false to say that the knowledge of God the Almighty limits a person's destiny, and he can only do that which Allah has already predestined for him. Free will is still there. The example is, let's say we are speaking to a person, and from his questions and his answers and from his discussions, we see that he has the intention of committing a crime later today, or perhaps he's asking about a certain home, and it seems as if he's going to commit a robbery in that home. And we have this knowledge based on our natural faculty of deduction. Does this mean that because we had that knowledge, he was compelled to commit that crime? Not at all. And Hazrat Muslim Maud, the second Khalifa, may Allah bless him, has mentioned this very concept in one of his beautiful writings called The Existence of God. He has mentioned this very example, that knowledge does not limit the free will of man. Man has the free will. Quite the contrary, since Jack was taking the same example forward, since Jack was going to commit the crime, this is why Allah's perfect knowledge knew about it. Not the other way around, that because Allah knew about it, that's why Jack was compelled to commit the crime. So it's another perspective. And similarly, even in a mother-child relationship, you will see that she will be able to deduct things very quickly about what her child is about to do. But does that limit his free will? Not at all. So this is the same case with Allah as well.
And we'll carry on, and if there's anyone out there called Jack, this bears no resemblance, purely a fictional name we've randomly chosen, so no offence intended, I'm sure. Dr. Saab, if I could come to you on this, I think Yasab has already talked on the specific attributes of God as well, and a sort of link to this as well. Tanveer Saab's next question, perhaps with reference to the answer we've already received, talks about how can Allah Ta'ala, God Almighty, be Lord of the worlds? He had even created the worlds. How can he be merciful? How could it be shown that he shows mercy? Similarly, how could he be giving or bountiful or just or anything else which requires a subject? He's basically taking every aspect of God's attributes that is associated by, not just by Islam, but all faiths, different faiths associate such attributes. And he's trying to say, what's the justification of those attributes?
Yes, but is it okay if I touch on the point of destiny? Just
by all means.
And then
destiny is important to us all, so please do.
I think it's a very intriguing point. And during our question-answer sessions, a lot of people ask about this issue, because it is linked to the process of accountability that you've just referred to. If everything's predetermined and predestined, then how can somebody be held accountable in relation to the example of the crime with Jack? There is no evidence from Quran that all our life is definitely predestined. In fact, what Quran is saying, that the human being is the pinnacle of evolution of life on this planet, and the fact that we are the pinnacle is because we have the choice option, which is also what Hamza Saab has referred to earlier on. And once we make choices, then the consequences become our responsibility. Laws of nature are what reigns supreme. If we live in harmony in terms of our understanding and our behavior to the laws of nature, then we are likely to be developing as a human race as well as individuals. However, if we contradict these laws in more than one ways, whether it's physical or psycho-spiritual manner, then the individual suffers as well as the society suffers. And some of the consequences about the greenhouse effects, etc., is in fact going in contradiction with some of the laws of nature, and therefore suffering as a human race. So touching on the point of accountability, there are different levels of destiny, and I think that is important for people to understand, so that this intrigue is taken care of. There is aspect of destiny that we can influence, and there is then another aspect of destiny that we cannot. If I am correct, these two are referred to in different words in the Quran. One is Amr Allah and one is the Izn Allah. Izn Allah, where if Allah wills, it will happen, but it's associated with certain conditions, and those conditions are in fact our responsibility if we fulfill those conditions. Amr Allah is something that is going to apply whatsoever. Now, there's no escape from a person who's born to ultimately die. So that's predetermined.
Indeed. You don't say, God willing, he'll live forever or something.
Exactly.
Yes.
And there is also a certain degree of inheritance in terms of how long they're going to live.
Indeed.
From their family makeup, any inherited diseases, etc. But within that span, say 60 to 80 years has been the genetic makeup of a particular individual, it would depend on how that person leads their life as to whether they're going to die at 60 or 80.
Indeed.
Or sometimes in between. If they start smoking or don't eat healthy life or don't do any exercise, then of course you are going in contravention to the laws of nature. So the same principle can also apply to our spiritual effort. And I think when there was a question about the worship, when we worship, it is our spiritual effort to grow spiritually and therefore develop ourselves. And it is important to then recognize that our destiny, to a great degree, is in our hands. Now, the other question that you referred to in terms
about mercy, about Allah's attributes.
Yes. I think partly, again, this question's been answered. We cannot apply the same rules of understanding to creation and the Creator. The attributes of the creation and the Creator are different. So Allah's attributes had to be there for them to be applied to a creation. In fact, logically, that is the only way to conceive it. To ask a question, how could God be Lord of the worlds before he had even created any worlds? I think, in fact, the other question is more valid. How could there be a creation if there was no God that was the Lord and the master creator? So there had to be a creator, and in fact I would add a wise creator, a well-planning creator, in order for a universe to be created that has all those very well systematized laws that govern the running of the universe.
Okay. Jazakallah, Dr. Saab. I think that you've touched on two very significant points, because too often it's this whole thing of fate is just lumped together as saying, well, it's fated. So, and I think your analogy which you draw with a person's sort of genetics, if you like, vis-a-vis the choices they do on life and how they lead their life is an important one. Hamza Saab, if I could come to you, just to comment on that, and also perhaps, again, continuing with the Naveed Saab's questions, next element, he also, perhaps in answering, you can also touch upon this whole thing that if God is all-knowing and he's created things, you know, he's placed a mountain somewhere, he's got rivers coming here, why then is it acceptable for man to then, if you like, interject and intervene and start putting dams in place, blowing up mountains and what have you? But coming back to the first point on the attributes, and then perhaps linking it to this concept of, hasn't God created everything perfectly, so why does he allow man to interject?
You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself that this is exactly the case, but then it occurred to me that in the Holy Quran itself, when it comes to the question of Lord of all the worlds, now naturally if one could conceive of an existence that has no existence with the exception of the person of Allah, right?
Yes.
Then of course there are no worlds, hypothetically speaking, for Allah to be Lord of. In fact, since there doesn't exist anything, then he is the Lord of even that non-existence. But I would recommend that the questioner take a look at the verses of the Quran. There are two that come to my mind. The first is that Allah himself, when he points out his act of creation, and it says on the last day, then he settled himself on the throne. This verse right here, he in fact answers this question, where he says, Allah exalted is he says, after I have created creation, then it became established that I was the creator of this creation. So Allah himself actually answers this question, that yes, I created creation, and once I did so, then it became established that I was the one who had done this. So this is the answer to the first question. And Allah himself, alhamdulillah, has provided the answer to that in his Quran. Yes. The second part of it, however, in terms of the two different types of decisions, the unalterable decrees and the alterable decrees, right? One of the reasons for this, which the promised Messiah and Imam Mahdi alayhi salatu wasalam, peace be upon him, have pointed out, one of the reasons for this, which touches back on our earlier question, man has been created to develop within himself the qualities of similitude that God has placed in him, so that God may in fact look into him like the one with the most beautiful countenance looks into a mirror and sees himself in the face of man. And man in fact can look into his own mirror and see the face of God, right? So they say, Man arafa nafsahu arafa rabbahu, he who knoweth himself knoweth his Lord. The reason for this is that, you know, they say adorn yourself with the attributes of God.
Indeed.
Right? So by adopting these attributes of God, the most beautiful names, as Allah himself has said, one does not see the servant, the abd, or the amtul, if you will, does not see themselves in that mirror. When they look into that mirror, all they see is the face of God. So this other attribute here in terms of this mercy, there's another verse that says, how can you disbelieve in God when you are without life, and then he gave you life, and then he will cause you to die, and then to him will be your return. 99% of human beings, if you ask them, no matter what kind of life that they're having, would you rather die or would you rather live till tomorrow and perhaps there'll be some change? They'll say, yes, I'd rather live. In fact, the need for survival is the strongest urge in man. So life itself, to be granted life itself from nothing, is in fact the greatest mercy that man has been given. So this is the first thing that comes to my mind. The second, which is somewhat linked to that in point number 6, saying that if God is omnipotent and all-wise, everything is already in the right place. This comes back to what I mentioned before. So God has given man out of his graciousness, like we say rahmaniyat, things that were given to man without him having anything to do whatsoever with it. Like, for example, right now in this room, we have all of this light, and we have been given eyes. However, if this light were not in the room, despite how perfect our eyes were, they would never even work, and we couldn't see a thing without the light of the sun. Same thing, you could not hear my voice, no matter how excellent your ears are right now, if there were not oxygen in this room. So there's a quality of rahmaniyat, or graciousness, that God has given man everything that he's needed before he even came into existence. In fact, man himself is in the womb. The Arabic word for that is rahim, right? This is where rahmat, or rahmaniyat, or graciousness comes from. But rahim also means womb. And God has actually pointed out to man that while you were still a fetus in the womb, you had everything. So you've had your bed, and you've got the warmth and comfort of your mother. You've got the umbilical cord delivering to you everything that you needed, and you weren't even conscious that you were there. Right? So that in itself is a mercy. Where does man come in? What is things being put in their improper place? When man, as we mentioned earlier, using his volition to put things in their improper place, so he sets up dams. Whenever man does things for the good of mankind, like God says, kuntum khaira ummatin ukhrijat linnas, you're the best people raised for the good of mankind. Whenever man does things for the good of mankind as a whole, there's much blessing, and God is very pleased with these things, no matter to what religion he belongs. But whenever a man puts things in their improper place, using the resources that God has given him, this is what, as Dr. Saab has mentioned earlier, causes suffering to himself, especially in the long run, and suffering to mankind. So all of these resources God has given to man, no matter what religion he is, no matter what his persuasion is, for the use of these things in a beneficent way for the rest of mankind. It is man himself who will benefit from these things, but it also means that it is man himself who will suffer the detriment when these things are used improperly. Things has already been set up for him in the proper place. It is man himself who puts them in their improper place and suffers because of them.
Jazakallah. Yasab, just on that sort of point, if I could come to you, I mean, this, just to dwell for a moment or two on the whole element of the faculties of man. And I think in question 6, when the Tanveer Saab's asking this question, it's the assumptions being made that he's taking an imperfection, that man is taking an imperfection of the world, i.e., and that's why he's required to build dams, etc. Now, if these dams are built for a viable purpose, that's man's faculties kicking, which God has blessed man with, as an earlier answer we gave was, that's what differentiates man from other parts or other living beings.
Absolutely. The thing which we must understand with regards to this question is that the use of human faculties for the benefit of society as a whole does not at all justify or qualify an imperfection in the creation of God the Almighty, because if those tools were not there for us with which we could use our faculties and benefit society, then how far would we have gotten in life? Similarly is the case with God the Almighty's creation as well. He has given, as Brother Hamza has mentioned, He has given us oxygen, for example. He has given us sunlight. He has given us other blessings which we did not deserve. We did not ask for them or pray for them. Allah, out of His infinite mercy, blessed us with those things. Now the use or misuse is what makes those things good or bad. And of course Allah expects that we will use these tools which He has given us to the betterment of ourselves and to the betterment of society as well. For example, the promised Messiah ﷺ has mentioned a very beautiful example in his commentary of the opening chapter of the Holy Quran, Surah Fatiha, where commenting on Iyaka na'budu wa Iyaka nasta'in, that Thee alone do we worship and Thee alone do we beseech for help, the promised Messiah ﷺ says, let's say there is a farmer and he has a crop, he has a set of fields, and he does not cultivate those fields and simply expects that because Allah is perfect, because He is the master, if He wants to do it, then by the end of the year I'll have a crop. The promised Messiah ﷺ says that this is a very, very dangerous thought, and it is an injustice towards God the Almighty, as if you are testing God the Almighty's power. Of course He has the power to do that. He can cultivate a crop without any effort or human intervention. But then how would we be worthy of reward? The fact that Allah has given us faculties to be used in itself qualify the fact that we should use those faculties. And Allah, after Rahman, He is Rahim. He is merciful. And the meaning of Rahim is that He gives us the reward of our efforts. If we were to work and receive nothing in return, this would be an injustice. But Allah says, no, I will give you. But the condition is that you must work. You must exert an effort. And Tariq Sahib, don't we see this in our worldly matters as well? Anybody who wishes to acquire success in his career or in his jobs, does he expect that I'll sit at home without going to an interview, without working, without studying, and I will be appointed a president of a company? Of course not. He works towards that. So the problem is that when we analyze and work in our worldly affairs, we understand this law very well. Everybody knows that they have to work hard in order to make anything in life. But when the spiritual realm presents itself, everybody becomes lazy and says, oh, if Allah wants, He'll do it. But this is injustice. Why do we not exert the same effort in those matters as well? In the laws of nature, in the laws of spirituality. Of course, we must deal with both of these realms with an equal hand, and only then will we be administering justice.
Jazakumullah, gentlemen. We're just going to take a small break now for our weekly book review. Viewers, this week's book that we're reviewing is the book Our God, Proving the Existence of God by Rational Means. This was written by Hazrat Mirza Bashir Ahmad, who was one of the sons of the promised Messiah and the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and it was first published in 1928. One of its main sort of elements or purposes behind the book was also aimed at the youth of the day, particularly with the growing rise of atheism. So it's as relevant today as it was when it was first published. If you have any thoughts, comments or observations that you've heard from the answers you've heard so far, you know what to do. It's faithmatters@mta.tv. So let's get back straight to some of the questions which are being asked. Now, Tahir Ahmed Saab from Germany, Jazakumullah, Assalamu alaikum, Tahir Saab, thank you very much for your question. Asks the question, how can I explain the concept of the existence of God to those who have a scientific bent of mind? And linked to that, another question we have is, if there is no compulsion in religion, as it says in the Holy Quran, and it is based entirely upon personal faith, then doesn't this mean it is impossible to scientifically prove the existence of God? Dr. Shakil Saab, if I could come to you first of all on that. Science, does it prove God exists?
Again, a question from an intriguing mind, I would say, and a big question in some ways.
Two intriguing minds, even.
Right, yes, that's right. I think it's right to say that if reason can lead us to God,
yes,
then there should be an automatic acceptance of that reason, and therefore why isn't it that people are beginning to accept this on the basis of a logical conclusion? However, I think before I try to make an attempt to scientifically demonstrate the existence of God, let me first say what promised Messiah, may Allah be pleased with him, says about the best way to reach God. And he's spoken of three basic principles, and they are evidence, witness, and personal experience. Evidence is all around us, as we've been referring to. It's the flawless working of natural principles, irrespective of whatever conditions. Witness is when we see with our eyes the the proof of existence of God or the promises that have been made by God to his people. So in spite of all odds and in spite of worldly and mighty opposition, the success comes to those who submit to God in a most sincere manner. That's witnessing God in action in our society. And personal experience comes through God listening to our humble prayers and then responding and blessing us with what he thinks is justifiably a response to those prayers. And there are not just thousands, millions of people in the world who have experienced God in this way. And I think once you've gone through that stage of your relationship with God, there is no doubt left in that individual's mind that God exists. So those are the principles given to us. However, I think that it is important to try to respond to the question in a more like a material sciences way as well. One of them is that, in fact, there are lots of points, so I'll just have to go through them, list them. There's a universal quest for God. It has always been there. Even before modern science existed, people were intrigued about God. When people had no ways of communicating with each other in history, independently those subcultures were intrigued about God and had their own ways of relating to God. So there is something inherent in the creation to try to not just understand their creator, but also relate to him. And that itself, in some ways, is a proof. Now, commonly, people think about whether God exists or not for one or two mistaken logics, I would say. One is out of sight, out of mind.
Yes.
And we know that there's so many things that we cannot physically see. We've referred to presence of oxygen and radiation, etc., but they exist. So similarly, there can be other beings, especially a creator, that would exist, and we may not be able to perceive with our basic eyes or basic senses. The other difficulty people have is the need of discipline. Recognizing the authority of a creator means that we have to lead our lives in a certain way by a certain code of conduct. And if it becomes uncomfortable, especially to those people who may not have been used to living in that disciplined way, it's a harder task. Look at the intelligent design of the universe. Can we comprehend anything being created even as our scientific invention, which has an intelligent design, but without there being some kind of wisdom or planning going into it? In fact, no. So how can we expect an intelligent, smooth functioning universe to be there without there being an intelligent creator? Another very important point, that modern science has led to the conclusion that consciousness, which can be defined as our awareness of our surroundings and our ability to relate to our surroundings, this is not possible to come out of lack of consciousness. So if conscious beings exist, that means a conscious creator existed before the conscious beings were born. And logically or philosophically speaking, if you do the cause and effect phenomena and keep taking it backwards, the ultimate cause of all causes is what you can think of comes from the creator, and that's God. So in that sense, I would say that the ancient science, the modern science, and even divine words or revelation have commonality about the existence of God or the evidence for existence of God. Aristotle said that it is not possible for the ultimate cause of all creation to be a creation or a created being in itself. Now what he's saying is that the ultimate cause is not himself being created, he is the creator. He didn't use those words, but that's what he's implying. Modern science of entropy, it says that if you create mass, then you're going to lose mass from in any process of creation of mass from mass, you lose some. But the creation of universe, in fact, is a very unique phenomena. It is beyond this particular scientific principle. It is creation of a huge amount of mass out of immense form of energy. And now the modern science has begun to say that you can actually create mass out of energy, and they speak about the concept of singularity, which is the origin of all universe. So that's also giving us first scientific, physical evidence of there being some form of energy and being that led to the creation of universe. It didn't come out in a haphazard way at random. But for me, the most beautiful argument, which is scientific, as well as it touches the heart of an individual, is the testimony coming from those who we know have been the most truthful of all ever in our society, and that's the messengers of Allah, messengers of God. They have been recognized by their companions or people of their times to be the most honest people who would not do anything for their selfish interest. And they've lived in different times in history and different parts of the world without there have been any material mechanism of communication between them. And all of them have actually succeeded in creating beautiful societies with high moral standards in their followers. And when asked the question, where do they get this guidance from? All of them point towards the one creator. So for me, there is no counter argument to this beautiful thing about recognizing the beauty of messengers of God.
Jazakumullah, Dr. Yassab, if I could just dwelling, I mean, that's a very comprehensive, succinct but very comprehensive at the same time response as well, both in terms of human nature, explaining the specifics, the cause and effect, reality. But a lot of people, when they sit back, they look at life and they say, how did I get here? What caused this to be? And what's the general purpose? And even for an atheist, I suppose, if you have a discussion with them, quite often the net result is, well, what created? What do you actually believe in? So ultimately, if they believe there was a Big Bang and then there was Earth, there was life, and so on and so forth, in a sort of strange kind of way, that Big Bang themselves, for them, becomes the creator. So there is a logical cause and effect argument to be used even with people who have no belief.
Absolutely, but one thing which we must understand is that who created the Big Bang? Was it a concept, or was it a phenomenon which occurred just by itself? This is where we differ. We say that there must have been a conscious being who resulted in the occurrence of the Big Bang, because as we know, nothing happens without a cause and effect. As you have mentioned, this cause and effect system, as we find in science, is something which is accepted even by atheists. The problem is that very humbly, I would say, without offending anybody, that atheist friends, they will go to that because they're in denial of God the Almighty's being. They realize that there must be a cause and effect system, so they will go up to the Big Bang or whatever they believe the scientific explanation for the origin of the universe is, but then their denial won't let them go any further. That's where faith comes in. And that's where we believe the promised Messiah ﷺ has mentioned that no matter how many arguments we present, this concept, we can bring you to the level that there should be a God. But this concept of that there is a God is where this aspect of faith also comes in. But we must also explain that that concept of faith is not unwarranted or unjustified, because as Dr. Sahib has explained so eloquently, that scientifically speaking, in order to have a system which works with each other, and you see no contradiction in the laws of nature, if this was by chance, then you should have seen some haphazard concept in the universe, but we see that everything runs in its proper measure. And this is the argument which is presented by the Holy Quran as well, that look at the universe, will you see any flaw? Look again, you will never find any flaw in the universe of God the Almighty. And this is the proof of the fact that there is a controller, a intelligent controller, which resulted in the occurrence of the Big Bang, or whichever scientific philosophy you would like to say, that began the universe, and then controls the universe as well to ensure that it doesn't slip out of its bounds, so to ensure that everything continues working hand in hand with each other. A scientist has mentioned something very interesting, and I love this statement. I was reading, and he said that to say that the universe was a haphazard phenomenon and created maybe by only a Big Bang or another scientific principle, and there was no guardian or ruler over that to control the course of events, is like saying there was an explosion at a printing press and a dictionary was formed as a result of that. It's absolutely unfathomable. And you see in a dictionary that every letter is placed in its proper place. so too do we see that in the universe as well. So how come when we accept that a masterpiece of literature cannot be produced without an intelligent hand, a good writer, how then can we accept that the universe, which functions with each other, can be created without a Lord? So we must understand that this intelligence is what proves the fact. This intelligence in the universe proves that there is an intelligent creator as well, and without that we have no other option, if you look at it from that aspect.
Jazakumullah, again, a very this question could dominate not just one Faith Matters but several, I'm sure. But we must move on to sort of another question, again continuing on the concept of the existence of God. This comes from Mansoor Khan, who asks, if God provides the sustenance for all living things as referenced by the Holy Quran, then why do some people die of starvation? And linked to this, we also have another question, Hamza Saab, and if I could come to you with this to begin with, is linked to that. If the laws of nature and the laws of Sharia are entirely separate and have no connection with one another, assumption, then how can anyone claim that a death, an illness, an economic or financial calamity, or indeed a natural disaster are punishments from God? Taking that together, this whole concept of people dying of starvation, and yet God should provide, or God says He's the provider for everyone, and then also this whole concept of, well, financial calamities. You're a banker and we'll come to that in a moment, but leaving financial calamities aside, natural disasters perhaps are more relevant to people thinking, if there is a God of mercy, why does He then allow such things to happen?
You know, I'm sorry, I'm just so inebriated by these wonderful answers to these questions. These are all very relevant questions, and while Dr. Saab and Ayaz Saab were talking, you know, I was reminded of a quote by Albert Einstein where he says, religion without science is dead. Science without religion is blind. Mm-hmm. And I always loved that quote. Mm-hmm. Science without religion is blind. Mm-hmm. So anyway, on that same basis, however, when I think of the question about these natural events, economic crises, and so forth and so on, I remember, of course, you know, riding my bicycle down the street and maybe trying out a few tricks or whatever the case may be, and of course, falling all over the street. Anyway, the whole idea was I learned a lesson out of it. Don't perform such tricks, or perhaps this is where I went wrong. Okay, so my point is that there are several things in our daily experience that in fact teach us what works well by it's running smoothly, naturally, right? And then there's the certain things that when they don't run well, teaches us what doesn't work, right? So there's two types of experiences that the Promised Messiah, alayhi salatu wasalam, peace be upon him, points out. There are trials that an individual, and an individual is only a microcosm of a large group of people. So we'll just take the individual and then we can relate it to a group or body or nation of people. We'll just point out an individual. This makes it easy to understand. There's two types of things that happens to the individual. One is by way of trial. In other words, that this is something designed to help develop this individual further in his psychological or spiritual development that he may deem as an unpleasant happening. But you know what? If that hadn't happened, for example, if you went to go across the street while the light was green and you got clipped, we'll just say it like that, by a speeding car, you know not to cross the street without looking to see if any cars are coming, right? Now naturally, someone of good intelligence would stand up from that and say, thank goodness I'm still alive. Well, I knew not to cross the street here again. So yes, it's unpleasant, but it has taught you a lesson. So both of these two examples, in other words, one by way of trial, something that is inflicted upon man, or something that's a result of man's own bad calculation or mistake that he learns from, and he knows not to do that again. And then there's something which the questioner has pointed out, a punishment from God. But what I would humbly submit is that punishments from God themselves are in fact a mercy. The reason for this is because it is designed to draw your attention to a greater good. You know, what often happens is that man sometimes gets himself caught up in certain things that he thinks is beneficial, in the same way that children do when their parents aren't looking, or when the children think their parents aren't looking. And this, in fact, isn't good for the child. And the parent knows this, and the parent wants to draw their attention away from those things. Well, God actually does the same thing, except that He lets the child taste the bad consequences of that thing himself, so that the child then runs away from those things, having learned the lesson himself, and runs back, as we say, running to mommy. So Allah does the same exact thing to His child, if you were, meaning His creation. He says, all right, so you have involved yourself in this, because, you know, within this thing, you have, again, as we mentioned earlier in the show, you have ignored, or you have become distracted from the most beautiful thing that I have in fact given you consciousness to discover, and that is me. And this is not selfish at all. It is only selfish when the thing which is the object of the love is limited or flawed in some way. But as we've pointed out with Dr. Saab, we find no flaw in the creation, we find no flaw in any of the attributes. All of the beauties and bounties that have been given to you were in fact waiting for you when you arrived here on earth, in life, in consciousness. So in short, all of these calamities, afflictions, financial crises, well, if you've had a hole in your pocket and someone told you not to put the money in that hole, and you put that money in there anyway, and you got home or you got to the store, even worse, and that money wasn't there, that's a crisis to you, especially since the clerk is now looking at you expecting to be paid. But you've learned not to put the money either in that pocket or at least to sew that hole. In short, there's a trial, which means that this is no fault of your own. This is just meant to develop other qualities in you: patience during the afflictions, steadfastness. Sometimes God in fact wants you to be nearer to Him, so that He can give you one of the greatest proofs of His existence. And what is that? The acceptance of prayer. The acceptance of prayer, as we talked about, the God that regulates this big material universe, right? And by inference, you say, well, if this is this, then He must exist. Science leads us up to that far. Well, God in fact says, Udu'uni astajib lakum. Pray unto me, I will answer your prayer. This in fact is the greatest proof of God's existence, as the promised Messiah, peace be upon him, points out. Because then the God of the heavens and the earth says to you Himself, I am present, I am with you. And in reality, many of the trials as well as the punishments, as God has said in the Holy Quran Himself, and when we intend to guide a people, we first afflict them. Meaning that we jolt them out of their being engrossed in all of these things that are in fact distracting them from the one true, most important purpose of their life, the beauty and the happiness and source of peace in their life. They have become distracted from. So, you know, they say, pinch me, I'm dreaming. What does the person mean when they say that? They mean that I'm caught up in this imaginary world and I need you to wake me up, so pinch me. What is that? A little bit of discomfort.
So faith, I mean, Jazakumullah, faith I think is ultimately prayer and these things. We talk about natural disasters. We very quickly, we're running quite short of time. We're into the last few minutes of the program. But just to pick up on this point, we hear about two elements. First of all, your good self, Ayaz Saab, just on this thing about the natural disasters. They occur, they hit the world. People obviously say God is not merciful because He lets innocent children die. What's the short answer to that one?
The short answer to that is given by Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi Rahimullah Ta'ala in his book Revelation, Rationality.
He's the fourth successor of the Ahmadiyya community.
Successor of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
Yeah.
He says, as far as an atheist is concerned, this objection is unwarranted because he doesn't believe in God, so then he should accept this as a natural occurrence. But as far as religious people are concerned, that is a different story. Those people who believe in God, they understand and accept the fact that there is a life which is to come, which is an everlasting life, which is the source of all peace and all blessing and all tranquility. And that is the life which we work towards in this world, to acquire the pleasures of that world and the pleasures of our God. So if an innocent child is taken away in a natural disaster, then this is not injustice, because Allah will reward him in the hereafter. So we must understand it from this perspective, and if we realize this, then it will be very easy to understand.
Jazakumullah, gentlemen. What's really easy to understand, we've run out of time, so we had a couple more questions, but inshallah we will be taking. Simon, thank you very much for your questions. We will return to that at a future program. But gentlemen, thank you very much for your contributions to a very absorbing program and a very important subject we were covering off, which was the existence of God. And of course, viewers, thank you to you. Without you, Faith Matters would not be the program it is. Just as a reminder once again, for questions, thoughts or observations on what you've heard today or other questions you may have, it's faithmatters@mta.tv. That's faithmatters@mta.tv, and a reminder of the fax number 44 for the UK, 208 687 8037. I said during the program our book review was Our God, and I finish, if I may, just with a quote from Hazrat Mirza Bashir Ahmad on the concept of God, and he writes, "Belief in God makes us feel united despite all our differences. The thought that we are the creation of an all-powerful God produces in us, human beings, sentiments of pure love, unity and brotherhood. The result of faith is that all bias, discrimination, mutual prejudice and antagonism disappears, giving way to love, affection, harmony, sympathy and brotherhood." Until the next time on Faith Matters, Assalamu alaikum.